Welcome. My name is Maria Balinska. I'm the Executive Director of the US-UK Fulbright Commission. And it's really wonderful to see all of you in this hall because you make up a very wonderful audience. We've got our US scholars and students who are on grant here in the UK. We've got Fulbright alumni from the UK Commission and also the Irish Commission. We've got partners from Queen's, from Ulster, and also friends from Belfast City Council, St. Mary's University College, the British Council, and the Coromila Centre. So as you know from this invitation that we sent out, this is a very special year for us, since it marks 75 years of education exchange between the US and the UK, and an opportunity to celebrate our more than 25,000 strong community of alumni, of change makers and thought leaders whose work has made such a difference to the wider world. 75 years on from signing the treaty between the US and the UK governments, we're proud to be the only organization promoting and supporting international education exchange between our two countries in both directions and for every generation. What also makes the Fulbright distinctive is that while of course it has academic excellence at its heart, it also is critically about civic engagement, compassion, and bringing together the diverse perspectives of our two countries to address our shared challenges. Because our driving belief continues to be that learning is continual and that education has the power to transform lives. So as such, we see ourselves in a unique position to bring together people from both the US and UK to exchange perspectives and ideas. Distrust, polarization, and the fear of difference aren't new problems, but these days they feel particularly acute in many aspects of life, both domestic and international. Whoops, sorry about that. There are many reasons why that is, but on the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreements, we've come together to focus on how we can bridge differences and build trust. In a few minutes, I'm going to be handing over to two American Fulbrighters currently studying in Belfast who will explore this question and more with a transatlantic panel of extraordinary bridge builders. But first, I want to introduce the Northern Irish Fulbrighter who's done so much to inspire this event and who yesterday welcomed our current cohort of American Fulbrighters to Northern Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organization, the Coromila community. Derick Wilson is the former director of Coromila, a community worker, a former Equality Commissioner and Reader Emeritus at Ulster University in education with restorative practices. He was also a Fulbright scholar in residence at St. Philip's College in San Antonio, the oldest historically Black college in the United States, which is where he began his work on developing a relearning framework for nurturing hope in the face of division and difference. And Derick is going to share a few remarks with us.
Thank you, Maria. It's always better to get applause at the beginning. You mightn't feel like it at the end. I've been asked to talk about transformative learning, and I've gathered at around the importance of places, relationships, and structures in building trust and reconciliation. I was born into the often separate, sometimes mixed streets around Duncairn Gardens in North Belfast. The dominant cultures were understandably ones of rigid separation, polite avoidance, or studied politeness. And yet some people still met together because of historical family connections that they often couldn't acknowledge, work or sport, creating excuses to meet. These meetings for me, at some levels, signaled that transformation was still possible in the midst of a culture of separation. Relationships are important. In 1965, yes, I'm that age, coming to Queen's University, I met Ray Davey, who was a chaplain there and had been 3 years prisoner of war. And he witnessed the death of 25,000 people in 3 days in Dresden. And then Ray invited many of us in the 60s to join the emerging Corrymeela reconciliation community. Ray came from that slender ecumenical tradition in Europe that opposed fascism in the 30s. But Ray's vision here was to challenge the sectarianism and ethnocentric beliefs in these islands. As a full-time youth worker, a stone's throw from here, although for our locals, we don't use those terms anymore. But as a full-time youth worker, I worked with Helen Lewis, who was a Holocaust survivor and who was a wonderful dance teacher who came to live in Belfast. And she transformed certainly my life and the lives of many of the young people myself and colleagues worked with here. She nurtured hope in all of us. But we also need safe and challenging spaces. I was a Fulbright scholar in the dynamic St. Philip's College, San Antonio, on the east side, the poor side of San Antonio. The first historically black college and Hispanic serving institution in the US. And in this place, they offered a transformative learning space where relationally and structurally, students gained their voice, gained a sense of place and agency, away from the cultures of mistreatment, shame, and judgment that they'd often grown up in the midst of. It was led by a dynamic black and Hispanic administration, many of whom themselves had faced discrimination and poverty. And in my presence, often I came across situations where in the midst of classes and also in corridors, students who were struggling would often be met by a staff member, including very senior staff members, saying, "I have stood where you have stood, but together we're going to stand with you and you're going to make a success of life." Places like St. Philip's have much to teach us here about an openness to the different other and about the potential of challenging, respectful discussions between us. Yesterday, for 4 hours, the Fulbright met at Corrymeela Centre in Ballycastle with members and staff. And we explored how this new 5-book resource that we're making freely available online, called Nurturing Hope, that was my Fulbright project, might be used. It's already going to be used in Korea, in Japan, in Colombia, this week, possibly in South Africa and Lithuania, as well as between these islands. And it's going to be available to draw down on the web. And it's about how we might transform the relationships and structures we are working within. The practices have been distilled over years of working here and elsewhere with educational, business, public and civic groups, and also, and I think this is important, with mixed groups from all the parties locally. Starting from practices with children upwards, if we are to actively nurture hope in the relationships, groups and organisations we are members of, we need to dissolve the dynamics that feed rivalry, conflict and scapegoating between us. And we need to consider how together we can promote dynamics and structures between us that don't dilute our beliefs and positions, but put relationships between one another first before sacred positions. So locally and internationally, I think we need transformative spaces to take risks. Spaces in which together we respectfully adhere the intimacy of our honest differences together. In such intimate spaces, we might mutually acknowledge our shared hopes for our children, our grandchildren, and hey, even for ourselves, because some of us want to continue to live here. Sam Keane, in a Pulitzer foreword, recently argued, there are signs that some individuals are awakening from the long, dark night of tribalism and political nationalism and developing what Tillich called a trans-moral conscience, an ethic that is universal rather than ethnic. And he asks, can we use our freedom to form compassionate communities? Nurturing Hope is offered as one of those channels to bring us into this space of imagination and ask the question, is compassion still possible between divided people? Coming to nearly 76 years of age, I still think yes. In my experience at Corrymeela and in all my other work with colleagues and friends and unexpected relationships in this society, I experienced this was and is the case. Some people from all sides have taken and continue to take transformative leaps of compassion together, and we need to be focused on them as well as others who currently might be involved in more aggressive stances. I ask really, can we together reconsider our relationships and the cultures of our civic and public organisations as being potentially transformative spaces? It's more than the texts and the research we generate. It's about the relationships, the quality of the meeting spaces and experiences and cultures of our universities, schools, colleges, classrooms, workplaces, and all manner of community and civic learning groups. In these spaces, can we develop common reasons for rejecting destructive ways of living and establish ways of living well together is the question I face. It's only if we face into this compassionate struggle and invitation that we will begin to act and think differently together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Derick, for setting us up for the conversation that we're now going to be having, and then, of course, that all of you, I hope, will participate in. So I'd like to introduce our chairs for this afternoon's discussion. Katelyn Barnes is studying for a master's degree in global security and borders at Queen's University, Belfast. She graduated from the University of Dayton with a BA in human rights studies and sociology. As an undergraduate, she worked with an advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. to promote legislation advancing global gender equality. At Queen's, Katelyn is researching the effects of Brexit and border legislation on women and girls in Northern Ireland. Paul Kyu-Min Lee is pursuing a master's degree in conflict resolution and reconciliation at Trinity College Dublin's Irish School of Ecumenics here in Belfast. Paul graduated from Yale and before his Fulbright year worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. He continues to work with Divided Families USA, an NGO that advocates for a formal mechanism for Korean Americans to reunite with their relatives in North Korea. Paul and Katelyn.
Thank you so much, Maria. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. Again, I'm Katelyn. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. I'm going to start by introducing one of our panelists, and Paul is going to introduce the other two. Monica McWilliams, who's sitting in the middle here, is a co-founder of the Women's Coalition, who participated in the multi-party talks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, and is one of two women who signed the peace treaty. She was born and grew up in Northern Ireland, about an hour away from here in Kilrea, and continues her work here as a professor at Ulster University. She's also taken on the role previously of Chief Commissioner to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. This is a long list, sorry guys. The Oversight Commissioner for Prison Reform, and was appointed to join the Independent Reporting Commission for the disbandment of paramilitary organizations. Beyond Northern Ireland, Professor McWilliams has also worked in conflict zones with local women's organizations, specifically in places more recently like Syria. She has a lifelong history of political activism, education, and advocacy work, and her research on domestic violence has been critical in informing legislation. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly introduce our two other speakers before we jump into the discussion. So I think their bios are much longer than this, but I just want to say these are two people who personally inspire me. So first, Lucas Johnson is Executive Vice President at the On Being Project, which you may know from the award-winning podcast, which actually inspired me to start my own podcast, and I think others as well. And he has deep global experience in conflict resolution and community organizing, including from experience as a leader in the U.S. community of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, IFOR, the world's oldest interfaith peace organization. He's been shaped by his time learning from veterans of the civil rights movement in the U.S., like Vincent Harding, and human rights activists around the world. Lucas grew up in a military family in Germany and then in Atlanta, Georgia, and is an ordained minister in the American Baptist churches. And then, let's hear it for Lucas. And Pierce McConnell is a program manager at Our City, which actually I think many of us passed on our bus tour on the Shankill Road a few days ago. And Our City has brought together young people from across communities in North and West Belfast since 2013. And he himself is an alumnus of the Our City program and leads its signature international program, Belfast to Blanco in South Africa. Pierce himself is from Belfast, graduated from Ulster University, degree in community youth work. So, yeah, turn it back over to you.
So I just quickly want to run over the layout of this conversation. Paul and I are going to ask a series of 3 different questions. We ask our panelists to keep the remarks to just a few minutes so we can hear the wide breadth of experience you all have and the brilliance you're all going to share. And then we're going to open it up with Paul's kind of leadership to a Q&A at the end so the audience can ask questions. So that leads me into my first question, and it really follows nicely after Derick Wilson, our Fulbright alumnus, in his talk about nurturing hope. And so, as he had said, we spent the day at Corrymeela 4 hours together learning about his Fulbright project in nurturing hope, which is so relevant as all of you have done so much work in social healing and peacemaking in different contexts. And so, Monica, I think I want to start with you specifically with the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement coming up. How did you nurture hope in a divided society, specifically bringing women to the table 25 years ago? How did you nurture hope when women were so underrepresented then?
Well, I suppose we had a call to action after the ceasefires, and we had been nurturing hope for decades. I mean, when we first got elected, people said, where did they come from? They must have fallen out of the sky, or they came from nowhere. Well, there's no place called nowhere. And we came from somewhere, and where we came from was from the community groups, the women's groups, trade unions, businesses, and women who had been at home, who thought after the ceasefires, well, we have some skills we've learned along the way, and there 10 parties were going to be declared for the peace talks. And we figured, we did the maths, we sat down, and myself and a friend, Avla Kilmurray, went out. I'd love to say it was for a cup of tea, but I think there was a glass of wine or 2 involved. And we started thinking about the possibility of forming a coalition of women. And it was really to put it up to the other parties, because we were fed up watching what was passing as a very patriarchal mainstream, very conservative structures that were passing here for politics. And we knew there was a small p politics going on, as well as this big P politics. We made the big decision. I still remember that room where we were pondering the idea of whether we should go into elected politics, because you had to run as a party to get to be one of those 10. And people said to me, you'll have blood on your hands. You're going to destroy all the good work that's been going on, places like Corrymeela and places like the community groups. And then this little voice at the back, in the room like this, actually said, it's time to wave goodbye to dinosaurs. And that was the moment in which there was silence. And we began to think, you know, this is one moment in history that may not come round again. There's a window of opportunity. As an academic, I had been writing about the importance of women in conflict resolution. I'd seen it myself. I was teaching students like you and saw the great potential in terms of leadership. But not wanting to take the bigger step to get to a peace table. And I figured if I let this moment go past, if we let this moment go past, it won't come around. And we can't go on just throwing in, you know, balls and shouting and whining and whinging about the need for women in mainstream decision-making if we're not prepared to put ourselves out there. We wrote to the parties. They didn't do us the courtesy of answering our letters. We became a kind of vanguard movement, and we purposely called ourselves a coalition because we wanted women from other parties and men to join us. Little did we know 6 weeks later that we were going to get elected. I was hopeful but fearful, And the night before the results came through, I lay in bed and I said a prayer. And this prayer was, please God, do not let me get elected tomorrow. And then I turned over and I went, oh, we've worked so hard in these last 6 weeks. Dear God, please let us get elected tomorrow. So I was totally conflicted, but hopeful. And of course, all of us were saying, look, we've run a good run, and if nothing else, we've put it up. And then we got elected. So you build on what goes before. There was pre-existing networks. There was a real spirit of hope. Because when you've lived with 30 years of conflict and know nothing else, that's what had become normal. So hope was a bit different. Hope for a new transformation. And it was that we built on. We had too much fear inside our bodies. We were very traumatized. And this moment suddenly came where you just had a little tiny bit of hope. Two governments, Irish and British, constitutional parties who had been there before, failed rounds of negotiations. For the first time ever, parties affiliated to armed groups, and then a group of civil society actors like ourselves. And there was a cross-community party, the Lions Party. But it was a very different kind of table. And so that was hopeful. The very first day we sat down, we were the only women in the room. There were 70 in the room. And about 40 of us were negotiators at the table. No, not even, maybe 25, and with our delegates behind us. And you can imagine the tension. There wasn't a person in that room that hadn't suffered loss, somebody been shot at. Some had, their fathers had been killed. Some had survived 12 bullets in their bodies. And I thought, there's an awful lot of harm and hurt here. But I just hope that they are also as hopeful as I am. And 25 years later, I still remember that moment.
Oh, thank you. That was wonderful. I think, Lucas, in your context, it's you talk a lot about social healing and this being a time where this is the time where you've seen the most kind of yearning for social healing and peace, striving for peace. And this is a little bit of a different context, I think, than Northern Ireland in the US. So I was just wondering, how do you think we can nurture hope in a divided society within your context, within your work with IFOR and On Being, seeing that this is, we're coming to kind of a forefront now?
I think the person that has taught me the most about hope was probably my mentor, Vincent Harding, who was someone who was close to Martin Luther King Jr. and someone who I had the privilege of learning from the last years of his life. And he wouldn't talk about the civil rights movement using that language. He would talk about the movement for the expansion of American democracy, or he'd say the Southern freedom struggle or something of that nature. And he would refer to his peers and everyone who sort of put their lives on the line in that era as veterans of hope. And so I learned a lot from him about the sort of transformative capacity of kind of giving yourself to the challenge of the moment. And I think that I see that happening all around me. I think in the US, from the vantage point of On Being, having been on public radio in the US for 20 years and being this listened to podcast, we have this people write into us from all over the world and from all over the United States, and knowing that there's something wrong in our society, knowing that they want, really eager to find a way to speak to people that they no longer speak to have a difficult conversation that seems intractable. People are really desperate for ways to do that. And that fills me with a lot of hope. Just the fact that people are aware and willing to sort of name that there's a problem, and then also they're sort of looking for ways to do something about it. And that's not the story that gets told about this moment, but it's happening all around us, and that's encouraging to me.
Yeah, of course. You talk a lot about the civil rights movement, or as you more aptly have said, the Black-led freedom struggle in the U.S. Comparing that to now, do you see hope where we are now?
In terms of, give me a sense of, if you're talking specifically about our situation facing Black Americans in the country.
Yeah.
And your question was, am I hopeful?
Yes.
Yeah, I would have to say that I'm hopeful. I don't. I think my, I think I'm probably quoting Derick here that hope is a muscle, right? It's something that I feel like we're in a moment where there's a lot of awareness. There's a lot of conversation to be had about how we transform this moment into something better, into something more. I think about, again, Uncle Vincent there would be these moments when I would be teaching with him. I taught a class with him at Morehouse College in Atlanta, another HBCU, historically Black college, university. And I remember a moment where a student stood up and said, well, he started talking about all the problems that hadn't been solved by our elders, all the things that hadn't been addressed. And he wanted to sort of kind of lay blame on some of the tactics and strategies, particularly the nonviolent choices. And Uncle Vincent would respond with this sort of, in this generous and loving way that he would always carry with him, the way he would engage us, and he would say, the good news is that there's never been a you before. Mm-hmm. Right? The good news is that, whatever we failed to do, you've never existed before. And so that in that sense gave him hope. And so he really modeled that potential, that capacity. I mean, I think I could probably talk for hours about specificity, the specifics of our situation and the things that we have to contend with, but yes, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Pierce, the other day we were taking a bus tour of Belfast. We got to see the Peace Walls, the murals, and we actually went by our city. And I was wondering, with West Belfast being hit by the Troubles, hit economically, how do you nurture hope in the youth you work with at our city?
It's actually funny too, because Paul messaged me when he'd passed by the office and said, just swung by the office, and then as soon as he said that, Alan says to me, Paul called in, and I says, why didn't you tell him to call in? He says, mate, there's 2 busloads. He's like, there's not going to fit in our office is just a small part in the shingle. But in terms of us, we use young people as a tool to do that. We bring young people together. We designed a program that had longevity to it, so long term. If you look at all your friendships and relationships in life, they were all formed over things over a long period of time. So your education, primary school, secondary school, higher education, sports teams, dance teams, things like that. So we wanted to create a program that had a long-term impact. So 4 or 5 years, you can come in at 13 and you can exit at 18, but you're going to get time to create real friendships, genuine friendships, and we've done that by focusing on the commonalities that young people have with each other. So often people look at the differences, but young people have more in common than they do differences with each other. Whether that's sports, Celtic Rangers, they like football, whether it's dancing, whether it's GAA, they have a love for something more so than they do differences. And we do at one of our beat sessions. Engagements is around looking at young people's journey so far. So some of the highs and challenges of a young person at 13, 14, 15 is going to be maybe getting into the school they wanted to choose, the passing of the highs would be getting into a school they wanted to choose, a sports team that they wanted to get select for, a family holiday. Then we also look at some of the challenges that the young people face at that age. Could be a family breakdown, a divorce, could be a loss of a grandparent, could be the loss of a parent. But what that does, if I'm from Ardoyne and I'm sitting on this beach in the sand sharing a wee bit about my life and journey so far, and I've had a family breakdown, and the guy 10 minutes down the road who has a different religious title, but he's from the Shankill and he's a Protestant and he's had a similar experience. None of my friends have experienced what I went through. They can't relate to me, I can't relate to the Emmons, but the guy with a different religious title has that, and automatically we have a connection now. We've built a connection that I don't have with my own friends, and I don't have with the people in my own community. And normally, just coming off that beach with one of your first experiences, you've now got a connection with someone who you've always had a stereotype or perception of that you shouldn't be building a relationship with or engaging with. And recently we done a survey with young people across North Belfast, and sectarianism and religion wasn't even in the top 5 in terms of issues impacting young people. Some of the high ones were mental health, drugs and alcohol, education, employment, poverty, social media. And sectarianism and religion's still in there, but it's not a priority. It's not on young people's agenda. These are issues that are impacting them regardless of the religion, regardless of the area they come from, regardless of the titles that they have. And when they're on our programs, they're working towards challenging those issues, and they're doing that together. Something else we always do is that we're encouraging young people to be who they are. So if you want to come in a Celtic tab, come on ahead. If you want to come in a Rangers tab, come on ahead. If you're from a Republican family, if you're from a Loyalist family, that's fine. You are who you are, but it's about growing acceptance of it. So this is me and you're you, but that doesn't mean that we can't get along, and that's something that we're always trying to encourage, that young people are not tolerating, because tolerating is not the right word, it's around accepting. And everywhere, a lot of other places in the world can accept people for who they are, and here we always try and find kind of the minority things to dislike each other or not engage with each other, and it's about kind of pushing those aside and having a general holistic approach to it, and having that acceptance for them. So there's just an accumulation of the things that we're doing as an organisation, but we can see these happening on a daily basis in terms of the friendships, the relationships. Like, we have young people on our project who have come through our project, have children together, or living in shared housing estates, things like that, and that provides us with plenty of hope, because they're leading by example, and when other young people see that, then they're kind of going, well, it's possible, and if they can do it, I can do it, and this is part of it.
I think what's so wonderful is kind of the generational fanning of the flame of nurturing hope, this idea of having mentors who've taught you and inspired you, and working with young people. It is just this group effort of kind of keeping hope and resistance alive. So thank you so much. I appreciate you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, the next bucket of questions was on the theme of international experiences. But I think that's a theme that is kind of, the value, at least in the short term, is self-evident to a lot of the people in the audience. A lot of us are on international experiences right now. And I think the three of you exemplify kind of balancing this working in a local community, but also crossing borders. Just Monica yourself, you're in South Sudan, and then the US, and you said you're going to Kosovo soon as well, and Pierce, I know you're going to South Korea as well. You were in South Africa recently. Lucas, I think
I was going to ask for your passport too a minute.
You
just came from the Netherlands.
Get stopped all the time with that passport, believe you me. If you go to South Sudan or Iraq, the Americans don't want to know you these days.
Yeah, sometimes. You don't want to reveal your identity. But and Lucas, I know physically, you came from the Netherlands, but I know On Being reaches international audiences and has guests from all over the world. So I guess I just wanted to open it up a bit to see if you could be in conversation with each other about the long-term impact of international experiences. Because say we had a workshop at Ulster University about what we want to do with the remainder of our time on our Fulbright year. And in the short term, it's great. We make these relationships and have these great photos and lessons. But the question is, what do you do with these international experiences in the long term? And what's the impact and value of these international experiences in the work that you do in the longer term, well after just the year-long program or the week-long program? So I don't know if any of you want to...
Well, I think one of the benefits I think we've had in Northern Ireland are the exchange programs. I was in DC last week, and they've had a Washington, Ireland program running for years. And I was hosting at Georgetown some of the graduates, young people who were now politicians from that program. And I was saying 25 years ago they wouldn't have sat together on the same stage. But now they can. We couldn't even go into photographs together. And the good thing was that when you're taken out of Northern Ireland and put into a different context, you're staying with families that host you. and they needed the continuity of that relationship building when they got back here, and we weren't always good at that. They were building relationships when they were taken out of the country, but forgetting about continuing it when they got back home, and over the years we got better at that. Certainly a big influence on my life was, I was at the Queen's University down the road as a student in second year, and my boyfriend was murdered in 1974 during the Ulster Worker Council strike, and I thought, I'm getting out of here and I'm not coming back. This place is never going to change. And you do that at moments of despair, but the opportunity came to have a scholarship and an exchange scholarship with the University of Michigan, but it was all one-way travel because there wasn't any student from University of Michigan was going to come to Belfast in those days. And I was a very poor student in Michigan, which was a good thing too, because I had to stand on my own 2 feet. And it taught me the value of independence, of getting out of here once you overcome your homesickness and realize you're on your own and have to build friendships. And the person that really mentored me and changed me was an African-American professor. I was studying architecture and planning, and he allowed me to join his all-black group of students because I came from Belfast. And it was absolutely liberating for me to go with him to the Grassroots Organisation of Workers. You can imagine from that title what it was like in Detroit.
Yeah.
Well, such a shock as I got in Detroit, and decided to do a thesis on comparing the redevelopment of inner-city Detroit with the redevelopment of inner-city Belfast.
Was Grace and Jimmy Lee Boggs?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I suspect
They
that.
were
Yeah.
right with me,
Yeah.
and in my book I write about the influence they had on my life. And that professor actually went on to design or help design the Martin Luther King sculpture in Washington, D.C., but he took me everywhere with him. And that was my experience of learning to advocate, to lobby, to design, and I brought all of those skills home. So that's a very long answer to your question, which is get out, bring a pile of skills into your head about how to do this work. It doesn't have to be in the limelight. Change comes dripping slowly, but I remember watching a terrible bomb that had happened here, the Le Mans bomb, which all of us will remember, were almost the equivalent of the napalm was thrown into a hotel and burned people alive who were at a reception. And I was sitting watching it in the common room at the university because I watched the news every night to see what was going on. And I made my mind up that night to go home. And there's another lesson, is the work I do now with many Afghanistan women. It's mostly women, all women that I work with, and Syrians. My heart breaks because they can't go home. And they've got these skills and they're learning so much, but they have to remain in exile for their own safety. But I still say to other young women that I meet, when you get this Fulbright and when you get these skills, go back and invest it back in the country where you've come from. Because we can't afford brain drains, we can't afford people to get the scholarship and make a bright future unless they're in exile in another country. So that's what I took from that, was to bring it back home, and that privilege that we have to be educated like that. And of course the anti-apartheid movement was on. I was marching against the Shah was being deposed in Persia, as they called it. And we wore these brown bags with slits, which is what they did because they didn't want to be detected by SAVAK, the secret police. And all I could think of was, why weren't we that smart on the civil rights marches in Northern Ireland? That we, of course, all our faces were being detected. So those were also some of the smaller skills that I brought back, and that's a lesson as well.
Discrete skills.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing those anecdotes. I know you've also shared about how, I think you said you were locked in a room with Nelson Mandela for a few days in South Africa, and how powerful that experience was, learning from him.
Probably one of the most powerful experiences. We were taken out, not everybody knows this, but we were taken out of Northern Ireland. After the first year of the talks, there was a bomb that had gone off that broke the IRA ceasefire in London. And there was a possibility that we might never get those talks to work. And someone had the bright idea that the South Africans should talk to us. And so we were taken in 2 planes because the parties wouldn't travel on 1 plane. And we came and landed in South Africa. We went on helicopter. I didn't know where we were going because, well, I think it was a small plane. It was all blacked out. It's the only place in my life that I didn't hand over my passport, that you could land in a country and be taken quietly to a military camp. And we were dumped in this military camp, and I had small children. I thought, how am I going to contact my kids? Because you weren't allowed to make phone calls, because the media were destroying our process at home. So we were going to be there in secret for 3 days. Nobody was to know we were there. And we were locked up with President Mandela. Not bad. If you're going to be locked up somewhere for 3 days, it's good that it was President Mandela. But de Klerk's people were there, Buthelezzi's people, they've right-wing motherland people. It was the most fantastic 3 days, because all we did was sit and listen. And the other thing that we did, and this is the other good thing about being out of the country, and feeling a lift, that kind of constantly looking over your shoulder to see who's listening. And I gave my key to the 2 loyalist leaders and said to the Republican leaders, go into that bungalow and no one will know, and sit down and talk about what needs to be done back home. So those are the kinds of things that you can do when you're taken out of a country. And Mandela was fantastic. He said to us, you're all Christian and you're all white and you all speak English, but you really hate each other. And then he said, because we had 2 of everything, with two rooms, 2 speakers, he had to do his talk twice. And he said, you've brought apartheid back to South Africa. And that slowly got into my head. And I thought, if we do anything else, and we're still at it 25 years later, we have to end this apartheid that we live with in our heads, in terms of what you just said about the commonality that we have. And it doesn't, what is common in terms of, you used the religious title. I haven't heard that phrase before. I think it's a very good description, that religious title or political identity. And so some people now describe us as living in a benign apartheid, and that's the sad part of our politics.
Yeah, just on the topic of South Africa, and folks want to learn more about your stories, you should check out this book.
That's the best plug I've ever.
But given our limited time, I was wondering actually if we could hear from Pierce for a little bit before going to Lucas, especially on South Africa, especially considering...
Just one of my personal experiences, which I always refer to, is around how, but before I went to South Africa and got the experience, I never really valued education. I always seen education as like a problem, and I think I don't know if for any of you around upbringings or working class communities, you're always trying to find a way out of education. If the heating's broken in school, I'm not going. You're on the beach trying to get away from school. If you've hurt yourself, you milk it. If you don't feel well, you milk it and try and get the full week. I was always looking an excuse to get out of school, to get out of education. I can hear people laughing because they were definitely doing the same thing. But when I went to South Africa, it was there I realised that those young people seen education as an opportunity. They seen an opportunity for a pathway to a different life, a better life, to get out of the circumstances that they've been handed in terms of poverty and all the other issues that they're facing. And when I came back, it really pushed me into a mindset of where I wanted to value education, and I wanted to use education to change my life, because, and I think this goes for all of our young people, the young people that we work with and go on these international experiences with each other are from some of the most deprived communities in Belfast and in North Belfast, and some of them never get the opportunity to travel. Some of them don't have that self-belief, and some of them are kind of confided and feel like they're a product of their environment. And for us to be able to give them an opportunity and them to earn that opportunity and make the most of it, when they come back, their whole aspirations have changed. They've got a self-belief. I've done this, what else can I do?
Brilliant.
And they know that now I've seen another part of the world, I've seen a different lifestyle, I've seen a different culture, and it changes their goal setting and what they want to achieve. And I think those are some of the massive things that I've took personally, but from the young people that I've worked with over the last number of years in terms of international, I know that's what they're getting. And one of the other things is too, is that when, again, talking about like nurturing that hope and stopping the divide, is that when the young people are working in terms of the process of getting to South African international element, they have a common goal now. And even once you get there, you haven't even started your international element, but they've already achieved something together. They've done a year of preparation, of fundraising, of ensuring that they actually get on that trip, that they get on that international. And when they're there, that sense of achievement and togetherness is already built within them, where look what we've got here already just by ourselves, look what we have done. And I think things like that are absolutely massive. And then further on to it is that those young people know the local issues that they're challenged with, and when they go abroad, they see them in a global context, and they see them in different extents. Yes, we face poverty here, but now they're seeing it in a completely different context, and they're looking at methods and approaches of how other places are dealing with it and challenging it and trying to overcome it. So those are some of the things that our young people, and even me personally, have got from some of our international experience.
Oh, thanks for sharing, Pierce. Before I turn it back to Katelyn, I was wondering, Lucas, if you want to comment on anything, the impact of your national experiences, positive or negative.
Yeah, I mean, a lot comes up with this subject. I've spent half my life in Europe and half my life in the US. And I think one thing that comes to mind is the extent to which I mean, as a teenager, I was born in Germany. My father was in the army and lived there until I was 8. And then we moved to Southeast Georgia. And Southeast Georgia was very different than West Germany at that time, if you can imagine. And you know, there's a lot I could say there, but I grew up with a bit of ambivalence towards my relationship to the US. And I had to fall back in love with the struggle for the America that has not yet been, to refer to Langston Hughes's reference. I mean, I had to go through a whole process of rediscovering my sense of belonging and connection to the country. And not just to what the country was, and I had to kind of deal with some pain and some grief, but also to what the country could be. And so that's a part of that story. And me navigating, like looking for sort of belonging both in both contexts was a helpful thing for me, to actually be able to kind of see the US for all of its challenges and still acknowledge my connection and my belonging. Also to be able to see Europe for all of its challenges and to be really sober and clear about that. So I guess, you know, if there's a lesson in there, it's about, you know, I think that sometimes international experiences can tempt us to distance ourselves from where we come from. And so resonating with part of what you said, Monica, to the importance of going back and giving back. The other thing that I wanted to say is, you know, part of what I, you know, had the honor to do in earlier parts of my career was I would take delegations of Americans to places like the West Bank and Palestine and help them be able to sort of witness what was happening there in conversation with Palestinian nonviolent activists who were against the separation barrier and the dehumanization that was happening in that context, and those activists, Israeli allies, and to be able to kind of help people, you know, given the U.S.'s position in the world, right? Given the sort of responsibility that we have when we go to the ballot box and when we advocate for different communities, to be able to help us be more informed about what was happening. That was a really valuable experience. So being able to kind of help people deepen their knowledge of our own, you know, responsibility and you know what it ought to mean to be a responsible citizen in some ways. And then the other, you know, on the other hand, I was able to bring Black Lives Matters activists. This is right after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and I would bring some of the folks that were with me there in Ferguson to Europe. It was right after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, and that response in Belgium in particular, and the Netherlands to some extent, but also in France, the police response to particular communities was such that it was shockingly familiar, right? And to be able to create a kind of intercultural exchange, it was complicated, right? Because on one hand, it was not the same experience, right? And being able to create space where people were not, it wasn't about, you know, there was one moment. So in the Netherlands, the Dutch police in The Hague had killed a man named Mitch Enriquez, and there were protests, and there was a moment where I remember speaking. I was with some American activists, and I was talking to a Dutch activist, and the Dutch activist wanted us to say that it was just as bad in the Netherlands as it was in the U.S. And of course, we couldn't do that. But then that also wasn't the point, right? Because it shouldn't take multiple people killed for it to be bad, or it shouldn't take multiple people killed for it to elicit a response. And so creating that context for an exchange, and for us to, there's a tendency to sort of race to the bottom when we're making these comparisons, or at least the politicians always want to cite some worse example in order to lift up, in order to justify inaction. Creating that space for affected people to engage each other, and for a more honest conversation to happen, and for people to be able to sort of reflect with more complexity and nuance about a shared problem, about a human rights problem, about a human problem that we have in our societies to confront. One last thing, I think I hold that in my mind, and I hold all of our issues with police violence in my mind, and then I think about my experience in Juba in South Sudan, and then I think about how the struggle that people there were having to sort of establish police that could investigate crimes against women and so on and so forth, and how these experiences help give us nuance and context that I think inform our citizenship and our advocacy in ways that are really valuable.
Thank you for teasing those up, because, I think it helped me realize there's no hierarchy of suffering or oppression in a way, and just reminds me of, I think your colleague, Padraig Ortuma, one of his poems. It's about counting those who were killed during the Troubles, not just 1, 2, 3, 4, but I think something like 1 and 1 and 1 and 1, and how these international experiences, it's not out of a vacuum. It's international experiences of those of us from the US or those of us from Northern Ireland, and how it can act like a mirror to our own societies and our own identities. But we could go on, but I want to turn it back to Katelyn.
Yes, of course. So we talked about international experience and how that impacted your work. But as we know, Fulbright, we're getting an international educational experience. And so I'm really curious to know about how you see the role of education and learning in building trust in communities and facilitating these trust-building conversations. Monica, I would love to hear more about, I know the Women's Coalition pushed for integrated education in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement, and as we know, the 7% number of integrated schools currently, 7% of schools are integrated in Northern Ireland. How important do you see education in facilitating or building trust in this community, and how important is pushing for integrated education?
I think Pierce would be better at answering
Perfect,
that
Pierce,
question.
what do you have to say?
Huge shift in there.
I mean, what we did was we saw the awfulness of not sharing your learning and being strangers to each other, and then being thrown in together at university, which would have happened to you. I taught community youth work, and the difference it made when everybody was piled in. And then I started those women's studies programs to give access to women in the community who had no formal education, because I could see they were born leaders. But they didn't have the money to get to university, and they needed childcare and fighting the system to get that free childcare so they could get the opportunities if you come from working class, low income areas. And that taught me, when in those classes, the importance of integration. Because many of them didn't know each other either, and then they stayed together. And after they finished those programs, they remained together, and that was the birth of the Women's Coalition. As it was through many other pieces of activism. So yes, integrated education. My good friend May Blood, who's led that campaign, has died just before Christmas. And in her memory, we need to keep it alive. She fought all her life in later life to tackle it. And it is an issue for our churches, and for our politicians. I still struggle to think why there's not more leadership there, because they can see it works. And it's not the entire solution to our problem, but it's one of many. And it's sad for me, who wrote that in 25 years ago into our peace agreement. And those things generally don't get written into a peace agreement. And we were told to behave ourselves that night when we wrote that section on reconciliation and victims of needs. And would you please go away with more important things to deal with? But we didn't tell anybody that we were writing it. We just stuck it up and kept firing it up because everybody was so tired. And the British and Irish government were kind of going crazy, and we were all hallucinating at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we managed to slide it in. And I am very glad that we did, because when people read the agreement, they could see it was wider than just taking the gun out of politics or important power sharing arrangements or the big stuff. And this is big stuff. And you try to tell people that we need to be moved on now, 25 years later, from 7%. And most of the money has come from the United States. Now, finally, we've got it into the programme for government. And for all these years, the demand for integrated schools far exceeds the supply. And what's that telling you? There's a real thirst. What I'm loving is there's a question which not all of you will know, but in our Fair Employment, there's a monitoring sheet that you tear off, and it asks you if you're a Catholic or a Protestant. Because here they still have to monitor if you're a fair employer. I don't know if they do this in the States. Maybe they do it in different ways. Guess what the next question is? What school did you go to? Because if you refuse to put down that you're a Catholic or a Protestant, if you were born here, if you were born outside the country, it doesn't matter, right? But if you were born here, you have to tick that box. And if you refuse to do it, you then have to say what school. And of course, that school determines whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. Well, more and more and more.
One of many ways that the tell of somebody's where they're from or what religion they're from.
Yeah. More than even the address would tell you. But more and more are now integrated schools. And more of people like me, when we went into the assembly, were the other. There's nationalist unions and others, and that's how we vote. Can you believe it still now? Of course, 25 years later, we're having to look at that. And as we look at that in terms of this category called other, and those are the kids who will be the next generation of parents who have come out of integrated education. Well, we can't go on always describing them as other. They are somebody. And so that's the new Northern Ireland. And it will grow. It's no doubt about that. When Mandela told us, and we were sitting watching the leadership of Mandela and others, and I was a bit sad coming home on the plane, and I was kind of thinking, gee, I wish we had Mandela. And then I remembered those words, go home and grow them. Grow your leaders. And that's the same with the integrated education. We need to grow our leaders to support integrated education and support the wonderful things that are going on in those schools, because there's a new generation growing up there who really want to live a different life like the one that you're showing the kids in our city. And they're blossoming. You've just spoke about your graduates and how they have learned through sharing and doing it with others. And there's still very limited opportunities here. I don't know if you've noticed that in the time that you've been here. You know, our spaces and places are still quite limited in terms of feeling safe and being able to do that sharing. And of course, if it's not under one roof in a school, where could it be? And let's not do what Bosnia has done, which is, what is it they say, 2 schools under one roof? When I was there, the Bosniaks were coming in the front door and the Serbs were coming in another door. How shocking, and they called it integrated education. So we know what isn't working and what we shouldn't be doing, and we do know from Northern Ireland's experience now the good models of education here. And we've got shared education. I think Hillary Clinton's going to cut a ribbon next week or the week after on the Limavady campus, where they've got a shared campus. And so the big question for us now is that integration, or is that something different? So maybe we just have to keep looking at this and see what works.
Thank you. Speaking of growing your leaders, I think it's a perfect time for you to talk about our city. I know you really pride yourself on having or offering a certification in leadership for your youth participants. How important is promoting and preparing young people for
One of the things we try to do is obviously the areas that we work in are two of the biggest underachieving areas in Northern Ireland, Ardon and Shankill. So we were obviously trying to rebuild trust in our young people around education. And through this, we developed a partnership with Furuga, which is one of the largest youth organisations in Ireland, and Queen's University. And the idea behind this was around bridging the gap for young people and their access to higher education. Because even me, I went to university, I was the first in my family. If you ask me, did I know anybody who went to Queen's University, I generally didn't. I knew probably now, I still only probably know about 10, 11 people that's actually went on to Queen's. So it's always been one of those things that seemed unachievable if you're a young person at 13, 14, 15, 16 in a working class community. So something that we were trying to develop is trying to bridge that gap and try and make it more accessible and make young people believe that they can achieve university status, and in particular Queen's, because it's so prestigious and people look at it and go, oh, no way I'm going to be able to go there. So we developed this partnership with Furuga, and we were doing, which was accredited at a level 3 foundation certificate in community action leadership, and the whole purpose behind it was upskilling young people in like communication, interpersonal skills, their confidence, their goal setting, their interpersonal skills, and trying to prepare them as best as possible to get in the adulthood, so if they were getting into higher education or employment that they felt ready for it. And through a long process and some conversations and partnerships with Queen's University, we got the three of us in a room, and hats off to Alan, who done a hell of a lot of the process of it, and the rest of the staff team at our city too. But by hook or by crook, just recently we got it over the line, and it is being accredited at now, a level 4 certificate in community action leadership. And what that's going to do is become almost like an access course for young people, that if they complete that through our programme, that it will give them like UCAS points and CAP points towards their access to Queen's University, and for certain courses it's going to get them almost like brownie points towards it. So it's been massive for us, especially now, because we feel that because of the impact that we're having in this new generation of maybe participants and students and young people that we have coming through our programme and other youth organisations too, they're starting to go to university. So now the new generation is looking and going, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And I can't really remember off the top of my head now the university for the higher education status statistics for Ardon and Shankill, but I know that they've definitely been on the rise over the last, from I went in 2016. I think it was at around like 3.5%, and the last time I looked, I think that we were up to like 6.7 or something. So you can see the rise, but you can also see it in terms of even our programme, the amount of young people now coming in and looking UCAS help and preparation for it and interview help, and the sheer amount of numbers. Like in my year when I went through our city as a young person and went in that transition in the volunteer, there were 6 of us. Now if there's 50, 60 young people in our programme, there's maybe 30 of them with the hope of going to university and applying and being encouraged. And I think that's now there's a community belief, and there's that there community kind of perspective on it that you can do this, and it's definitely on the rise, and it's been massive for us. And even in an informal sense, we work with young people as young as 13, and we're constantly trying to, for us, we feel like a lot of them young people, if they're not in integrated education, we're providing their first experience in a shared space or a shared environment. And it shouldn't take to the age of 13 or 14 to experience that. It's crazy, because we're finding too that they're coming with like stereotypes and perceptions that have come from their parents or their community or their peers or things that they've seen. And you were talking about the peace walls, and a lot of people won't see it unless you're from the communities, that there's like invisible peace walls, like mentally, that there's nothing there stopping you, but in your head you're going to go, you've been told you can't go by there, or you can't go to that stage. And a lot of that plays in young people's minds, and when they get that experience of meeting new young people from different backgrounds, different religions, they start building their own perception. Do you know what I mean? They go, they're not so different, that's not everything I heard about Demons or I imagined Demons to be like. And they're starting to build up their own perception, their own opinions, and then that's when the friendship starts, that's when the relationships start, and that's when those wee barriers and walls come down. And that's just some of the things that we've done. And also as well is that us as practitioners, and I think adults, need to lead by example too, because young people are easily influenced and they do what they see at times as well. So if they see negative role models and doing things not having good relationships and maybe having bad stereotypes, then automatically that's going to transfer down. Whereas if we lead by example with mixed relationships and shared spaces and shared sports teams, and then that becomes normality for young people in the younger generation too, and that's what we're trying to do. And we've just been recently, lucky enough, I actually said the wait, so it's all right to tell everybody, lucky enough to secure big lottery funding. So we have a process now where young people can come in at 13 until 18, but now with this funding we're going to be extending our age range from 11 till 21. So again, what
That's wonderful. I have so much to say to that, but just for time's sake, I wanted to go to Lucas and talk about, if I could just ask you, you talk about cultivating a disposition of learning. You've said that in an interview before. Can I just...
I did.
Oh, no. He's like, oh no.
Yeah, sure.
Can you talk about what that means, and potentially just with your work, whether it's in religious spaces or in civil conversations, how you see education kind of paving the space for trust?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly the context in which I said that, but I think I think that in many ways that we're talking about education, we're talking about formation, right? And how, a big part of what we talk about is at On Being is talking about sort of cultivating curiosity, right? And part of, I think, how we got here today, I guess, in that sense, in this sort of conflicted, polarized space that we're in the U.S. Public life, is that I think we stopped being curious about one another, and we don't sort of cultivate that. We've treated education as sort of a weapon, or sort of a notch on a ladder that we can sort of to kind of protect ourselves or insulate ourselves against some of each other, and instead of as something that cultivates a disposition of curiosity, something that kind of invites us into learning, not just about whatever our particular passion is, but about the world around us. And I think that part of the way we might see ourselves out of this is by just being curious. Curious enough to engage each other across lines of difference, and not suppressing those instincts to wonder.
I think that's really important. Just to add on, when we were at Corrymeela yesterday, one of the things I found so interesting was that you really do have to take a journey to get out there. You have to drive. It's not, in Belfast city centre, which I think somebody said that there were critiques of, but what I think is so important in that is that the people who are going, already have at least a tiny, maybe little bit of curiosity towards nurturing hope if you're kind of getting in the car and you're making that journey, which I think is really wonderful and kind of beautiful with the whole journey metaphor. So thank you. Pass it on to Paul.
Yeah, I got to say, it's time for the Q&A, but this conversation has felt like a microcosm of my Fulbright year. Like it started later than planned. Like I met some amazing people, like felt various emotions, heard some incredible stories. It's going by way too quickly. And I didn't cover half the things I intended to cover in my proposal. But I think for the sake of time, before I turn it back to Maria to close this off, I was wondering, maybe we have time for 2 quick questions. So if maybe we can get one maybe from one of the Fulbrighters, so from the US, and then one from Northern Ireland, from the UK.
I agree with a lot of what you are saying, like cultivating, curiosity and building relationships and things. For me, I know when I was at Carmela, I was talking about my personal experience of like every summer I get to go out. Sorry, I thought I was loud. I get to go out and kind of, you know, take a few 3 days to kind of reflect of where I'm at and like where I'm going. But I think it's hard. I'm an educator, and I think in Philadelphia, you know, we have the like largest like opioid crisis currently happening, and like the school I was working at, you know, these kids are currently walking through that environment each and every day. So I think it's kind of hard to, you know, have those conversations, especially with someone like me, who I'm like the only person who represents the student body within my school, and like no longer being there and whatnot. And like, so I think this is kind of like a question for all of you, like how do you, you know, working abroad and, you know, and having to leave like in these situations, like how do you, I don't know, get it there when it's like continuously in someone's face? Like I think it took me to leave to college in order to gain some sense of identity and curiosity in order to move forward. But I don't think a lot of students are seeing that currently. So like, I don't know if you had any advice or suggestions or kind of like insight on how we can keep it going.
Thanks, CJ. And can we get a second question together with that, and you could find a way to answer them together?
A question that I have is, in all of you all's journey, you've done some really like impactful and meaningful things, nurturing hope within the communities because you've had community impact. But I'm curious as to how did you kind of nurture that hope within yourself in moments where it felt like the obstacle or the challenge or the issue was just really heavy, and even though you were in community, you felt kind of that weight on you?
Easy questions, super easy.
Yeah, I think this might have to bridge it with some closing messages as well. So if the final where we started,
Paul is running you guys off stage.
Of how to nurture hope. So,
Yeah,
Monica, would you be willing to start?
actually, both your questions are kind of relate. I'm currently on this independent reporting commission to oversee the measures to end armed groups, paramilitaries that are left over from the days of the conflict. 25 years later, they're still around, and just this last few days, we've had some terrible conflict in an area not that far from here, where 11 families have been put out of their houses, and terrible attacks and a man shot dead. And in the middle of our meeting with the police the other day, the superintendent had to get up and leave the meeting because he was dealing with a crisis all over drugs, which is you've just mentioned. So you have to ask yourselves, where's the opportunities for those kids if that's what they're getting in their face this last few days? And there have been kids watching this, observing it, and witnessing the actual violence on their families. And we say we're in a peace process. So my point about that is to link in with what you're doing, because some of that is a policing issue, it's a criminal justice issue. You have to deal with taking these poisons out of these communities. And some of that is the systemic educational training opportunity issues, where you do not get recruits into those paramilitaries because the kids have no other aspirations, because they see these guys with big cars and bling and everything else. And instead, folk like you come in and are able to show them there's a different route here, or all of the good stuff I see with youth workers who we need more of, because they're often will identify with more of the youth workers than the teachers perhaps and others. And we stupidly started cutting back on all the youth services. You know, everybody thinks in an aftercare after a peace process you're not needed. When are they most needed was when people faction off from the old combatants groups into these criminal groups. And therefore, we should be investing in those very communities. So that's one thing, and there are others here. I saw Jackie Redpath, I think, was here, who's been chairing an educational review about how bad our schools are, because we cut our children off at 10 and decide whether they're successes or failures, depending on an exam they sit when they're 10 years old. And that's another disastrous route in terms of these kids. So there's a systemic issue. There's no question in my mind about that, but everybody wants to lock them up, throw away the key and forget about it, as if we're going to build more prisons. And you know what that led to in the United States. So where's my hope? I am actually finding it very, very difficult to create a different narrative at the minute, because I am trying to say that's one way we must go. And even people in my own family are saying, are you crazy? 25 years after a peace agreement, you still have time to want to be doing this stuff? You know, they're just scumbags. And one of the leaders of a chair of a Northern Ireland Affairs Committee said, annihilate them. Can you imagine using that language as a leading politician elected in the House of Commons, looking at an inquiry? Actually, they'll probably throw me off this commission tomorrow after hearing me say it. But you can't annihilate people, they exist. So you have to do what Derick said and have a more transformative approach. But, you know, you do get weary, and I am weary in terms of trying to figure my way out of this, because I am still trying to give that message that there are people that we must continue to invest in to get them away from these groups. And at the same time, I'm working with the leaders of some of these groups who want to transition. And Duncan's at the back there, and he's working with me on the same issue. And what we're trying to do is to see and believe, and we don't know, but we hope they're genuine, the ones that were involved back in the day, who feel lost and excluded and they don't feel they've got a political space. And they therefore want to hold on to these old paramilitary structures. So it's a very difficult process I find myself in at the minute. And I'm trying to keep a voice of hope up. And all I get on the media, and all I get in a societal cough about it, is those days are over, it's all, finish it, just cut it off, as if you can do that. And so I have to constantly find some hope myself, especially when members of your own family question what you're doing and saying, could you not just get a life and move on? So I guess it's an unfinished business. And that's where you need good support around you. And I do have that. But you are hearing tonight a very weary person.
Just in terms of hope and some of the questions, I always think it's about like being consistent and being persistent and believing in what you're doing. I know I'm still young enough. Well, sometimes people say I look a bit older, but I am young enough. But the hope comes from the young people you work with, and I know that there's some challenges, and there's always, even for us, there's contentious times, and there's certain times where our work can be challenging in terms of, if you look at the 12th of July and the 8th of August, and even the aspect of social media, because it's so easy for young people to get themselves into issues on that around sharing and commenting and offending other people. And we also get some heat from like community groups and people who don't want to see the communities be together, and they don't want to see people move on, and there always is a small minority of that. But I actually prepared for a question here around the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement and what the future generations hope for in the next 25 years. So I went and asked some of the young people that we work with, and this will maybe hopefully give you a wee bit of a message of hope, and because your hope does come from the young people and the work that you do, and when you see the benefits of it, then it'll always keep you going. So I started off, I've got one from every age range from 13 to 18 that our young people that we work with in terms of our young people, but I thought I would give us a bit of a laugh. So I asked my partner's wee cousin, who comes and stays with us every Tuesday, who's 6, and I asked a kid who I coach on my football team, and then some of them get a wee bit more. So Molly at 6 hopes that there's palm trees and coconuts and pictures of God on her teddy, and pictures of me, Chelsea, and her mummy. Dylan, who plays on my football team, hopes that we'll have new football nets in the park, and we get Cliftonville saying Mbappe. And in terms of some of the young people who are involved in our programme, Grace at 13 says that she hopes that there's no more homeless people on our streets, and that everyone has a safe, warm roof over their heads, to have peace and everyone be equal. Drew, who's 14, said, a more open and diverse society in Northern Ireland, more people introduced to new cultures. Bethany at 15 says, I hope we are based on diversity and embracing cultures and religions. We do not discriminate against others because of their differences. Addison at 16 said, a place no longer recognised for its history and past of violence and conflicts, but for our amazing communities and unique traditions. And I think that one's quality, because we are very unique, and it's a crazy place, it's an amazing place, but we are unique if you look at it in a global context. Rihanna 17 says, hopeful for the removal of political divides, removal of the peace walls in our country, as I feel they are a reminder of the divide between communities. We continue to strengthen our relationships. And Blake, who's 18, said, a place where we all feel safe and comfortable with each other, where we have built genuine relationships and a care for those beside us. We introduce more shared spaces, education, sports and housing. And I think just even listening to Emmons, when I sent that into our group chats with young people and certain ones and asked them for responses, and that kind of gives you hope, because these are young people from all different age ranges, all different age groups, different areas, different communities across North and West Belfast, and this is what they're thinking, this is what they hope for. So I think that kind of overall sums up where you've got the hope and you've got the drive and the passion from.
Final word of wisdom or benediction?
Yeah.
External, internal?
I'd say that, in terms of the young people that you're teaching as they pass through that, corridor of difficulty, I guess what came to mind is just to say to not underestimate your ability to sort of give them a little glimpse of imagination of something different that'll stay with them. I know you've probably had that experience where someone older, that you once taught has come up to you and said that one little moment, it meant something. It's just, I kept it, and so I would say just don't underestimate your ability to just create that little moment, because I think we've all had that in our lives. And then the other thing that I'd say is in terms of the, what came to mind was, again, something that Uncle Vincent taught me, just that you have to prepare to be in this for the long haul. And, he said this at a time he was looking at Andrew Young and Dorothy Cotton, and he said, I've been working next to these guys for 50 years. And so what he taught me in that is just that, you can kind of, you have this tendency to give everything and pour all of yourself into a moment and exhaust yourself, and sometimes you forget to take care of yourself, and you forget to give yourself the distance you need in order to show up as the presence you want to be. And so it's not exactly what you were naming, but I guess I just feel like part of what gets me really low is also when I'm exhausted, and I don't have the resiliency anymore to sustain those negative comments from the people around me. And I kind of I've developed, after, a near burnout, I developed a kind of internal monitor to help me take a step back and sort of center down and remember, what I need to remember to keep going.
I want to thank you for an amazing hour and a half. I want to thank you for not pulling your punches about the divisions and difficulties that face us, but also about making the point about the importance of places for cultivating curiosity, for having the space to cultivate curiosity. And with your stories and your examples and yourselves, you've shown the power of human relations to make a real difference. And that's it's really been a privilege to be in this room for this last hour and a half. I also want to thank Paul and Katelyn for doing such a wonderful job chairing. I also want to thank our sponsors, Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, for making this all possible. And I hope you won't mind me, because I was told that in Ireland, it is important to have a poem at one of these occasions. And I learned of a poem because of reading the poem on the Cora Mila site, and it is by the great Seamus Heaney. And I think it is quite appropriate, and it is very short. And of course, Seamus Heaney went to Queen's, and our Fulbright scholars go to Queen's go to the Seamus Heaney Center every year. And the poem is from The Cure of Troy. History says, don't hope, but then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge, that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Thank you again so very, very much.